What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. All right, so I decided to continue with this series I'm doing, like best players by decade, and I thought I would have to do two different videos because I'm gonna have to talk about two different players. I'm gonna have to do that. Like I was thinking about maybe just doing one, but for the 50s, I got to do two different players. One of them that dominated the first half of the 1950s, and the second one that dominated the second half of the 1950s. And it's the second player, I think, that kind of started, ushering in a more modern era, a more skilled era of the NBA. At least was the face of the league when the league was starting to usher in a more modern version of the game. Before I start, I want to give three honorable mentions. Number one, I want to give an honorable mention to Neil Johnston, who was the highest scoring forward with the Philadelphia Warriors in the 1950s. He won 3 consecutive scoring championships in the mid-1950s. And I want to give an honorable mention to Dolph Schayes, who was the leading scorer in the NBA in the 1950s, and he was one of the last players to still utilize the set shot in the NBA, and he helped to lead the Syracuse Nationals to a championship, I believe it was 1951, and that franchise ultimately became the Philadelphia 76ers, in the mid-1960s. And in many ways, Dolph Schayes kind of reminds me a little bit of James Harden. Not saying he's just skilled. Not saying he's, I'm not saying that, but Dolph Schayes was primarily an outside shooter, but he had a knack for getting to the foul line. He was able to, manipulate situations to make it appear that he was hurt more than he was, or more physical. Flopping, okay? It ain't something that just started. Maybe he didn't do it to the extent that James Harden did, but flopping, all right? And he was usually amongst the leaders in free throws made and attempted per season. One year, I think he led the NBA in free throw percentage. And he was also the father of longtime NBA player Danny Schayes, who played in the 80s and 1990s. All right, so, and I also want to give a honorable mention to Paul Arizin, who took what Joe Fulks did and brought it to another level. And he was a further pioneer of the jump shot. And he was a high scoring forward with the Philadelphia Warriors as well. And he won 2 scoring championships in the 1950s. And it was he and Neil Johnston that led the Philadelphia Warriors to their second championship in 1956. In that finals, I think they did it against the New York Knicks, or the Knickerbockers, as they were more commonly called at that time. So let me talk about this first player who was a player of the decade in the 1950s. It got to be Big George Mikan. Now, of course, I did refer to Joe Fulks as a superstar, but George Mikan was a different level. Like, George Mikan transcended just NBA fans. Like, George Mikan became a star to the level of other sports stars. Like, George Mikan got to the point where he was a dinner table conversation topic. Joe Fulks never really got to that level. Like, to the point like where people were talking about Willie Mays, Joe DiMaggio, Mickey Mantle, Sugar Ray Robinson, Rocky Marciano, to that level. George Mikan had got to that level. He got to the point where George Mikan, he was playing the Knicks. The marquee would not say the Minneapolis Lakers versus the New York Knickerbockers. It would say George Mikan versus the New York Knickerbockers. You know what I'm saying? He was the first one that you saw how modern day promotion today, it was starting to, be ushered in that era. He was Fifth Avenue. All right. He was the first star that you were seeing as we ushered into the new television age. So, the difference between George Mikan, though, and a guy like Michael Jordan and LeBron and Wilt is that he was not a natural athlete. He wasn't a naturally physically gifted guy. He was huge by his era standards, huge. But he was shy, uncoordinated, self-conscious about his height, and really showed no real interest in basketball. If anything, he was more interested in maybe becoming a priest. But it was a chance meeting with a young coach by the name of Meyer, who had just been hired as the new coach of DePaul University's basketball team, that saw George Mikan and thought that there was potential there. At that particular time, as hard as it is to believe, the prevailing notion was that tall people would not be good at basketball. As strange as that sounds today. They thought that tall people would be too coordinated and clumsy. Meyer did not believe in that. But he saw potential in George Mikan. He knew he was very intelligent. But he would have to work on some things. And what he worked on was, number one, his confidence, his mental makeup. He also, of course, worked on his skills, which is the most important aspect, I guess. He worked relentlessly on him being able to work on his post moves, work on his footwork, worked on his ability to make shots, repetition, left hand, right hand, layups, left hand, right hand, hook shots, left hand, right hand. You know what I'm saying? To the point where it was, just second nature to him, muscle memory. But the thing that he really had to work on was his coordination. George Mikan had suffered a serious knee injury when he was a child, which kind of led to his belief that he just was not a very coordinated person. But he worked on George Mikan's, I don't want to say athleticism, but he worked on his coordination. He had him jumping rope. He had him try to guard smaller players. He had him even hitting the speed bag to work on his coordination. Had him do push-ups. Weightlifting really wasn't looked upon as an advantage at the time. But he even had him go dancing with girls, of course. Anything to do to try to help his coordination, these things did work. George Mikan became a beast. You know what I'm saying? He was dominant with DePaul University. And he won several individual awards, several NCAA awards, several NIT awards. And he led DePaul in 1945 to the NIT title, which apparently was the equivalent of winning an NCAA tournament championship in that era. After his collegiate career, George Mikan would eventually join the Chicago Gears of the fledgling NBL. And his time with the Chicago Gears was very successful individually and team-wise, as they won the NBL tournament, championship tournament. But at that particular time, look, the NBA doesn't recognize that championship. But if you were to count the NBL titles that Mikan won in addition to the NBA championships, he would have 7 titles. All right, but the NBA doesn't count certain titles. All right, now I'll explain that in a moment. So he won the NBL title, and then later on, I think what happened, I remember from my readings, that franchise folded when the owner pulled that team out of the NBL and tried to form another league, which failed. So all the former players with the Chicago Gears were assigned to different teams. Mikan signed with the Minneapolis Lakers, who were at that time within the NBL, and they wound up winning the championship that same year. But this was the NBL. The next year, they switched leagues to the BAA, and I think they may not have gone to the tournament that year or all the way to the championship. So Mikan won 2 NBL titles that the NBA doesn't count. But technically, if you want to count those titles, George Mikan won 7 titles. But anyway, the next year, when the 2 leagues merged and they became the NBA, the Minneapolis Lakers became a dominant franchise. It was George Mikan, Vern Mickelson, the best power forward of the league, Jim Pollard, the best small forward, Slater Martin, the best point guard in the NBA. They were a super team. They were a super team. And they wound up winning 5 of the next 6 championships in the NBA Finals, including 3 consecutive from 1952 to 1954. George Mikan dominated the league. All right. I think he won 3 league scoring championships. One year he averaged 27.4 points per game. His best season he averaged 28.4 points per game. Now, the thing you have to keep in mind about that is this is still before the shot clock. So teams at that time were averaging between 70 to 80 points a game. So that's the equivalence of, say, someone averaging maybe close to 40 points a game today. So that's how dominant George Mikan was. Okay? In fact, his career averages were 23 points, 13 rebounds on 40% shooting. Now the 23 and 13 sound pretty dominant. The 40% doesn't, but the league average field goal percentage at the time was 33%. So it's the equivalence of a league average of 45%, with someone shooting maybe something like maybe 54 to 55% from the floor, which is close to what Kareem Abdul-Jabbar shot. So it's different from Bill Russell, because at the time, field goal percentages soared, but Bill Russell continued to only shoot 44% from the floor, which to me is why, as a player, George Mikan was a more skilled actual basketball player than a Bill Russell, even though Bill Russell was a superior athlete. You know what I'm saying? If you get what I'm trying to say here. Also, because there was no shot clock, teams could hold the ball for as long as they want to. And one particular game, the Fort Wayne Pistons held the ball forever. All right? Their strategy was to hold the ball, keep the Lakers on defense. And when the Lakers did have the ball, they tried to do everything they could to keep the ball out of his hands. Now, that wound up winning them the game. They won the game by the incredible score of 19 to 18. George Mikan still wound up with 15 of the 18 points, which is still an NBA record for most points percentage a player had of a total team's total. But teams were complaining about how dominant the Lakers were and how dominant George Mikan was. In particular, the New York Knicks owner, and he really hated the Lakers. He thought that it was unfair that they had George Mikan. All right. So what happened is the NBA in 1950, I think the beginning of the 51-52 season, I think it was that season. No, it was beginning of the 1952-53 season, I think. The 1952-53 season, excuse me. They widened the lanes from 6 feet to 12 feet. Okay? Because they wanted Mikan further away from the basket and to make him not quite as dominant. Okay? Because at that time, and that did help the game, actually, because it opened things up a little bit. Before that, Mikan was blocking every fucking thing. The way that they played, it was more. It helped spacing because it was too congested. So, that's partially also why the field goal percentages were so low, because everything was so congested. And Mikan being 6'10", everybody else being these little guys, he could block every fucking thing, or just the threat of him blocking the shot, it affected everything. So what they did was they widened the lanes and they instituted goaltending, where where if a guy is too late in blocking the shot, if he doesn't block it at the apex, and if it's coming down and he blocks it, that's a goaltend. So these were things done to make it fairer, I guess. And it worked to an extent. George Mikan, who was previously averaging 27, 28, 14, and whatever, now he's averaging more like 22, 23 points. So the scoring was down, but he still was a very dominant player, and the Lakers were still dominant. In fact, George Mikan was still the league MVP in 1953 and the first ever All-Star game in 1953. And the next season, George Mikan, getting older, remember this is a different era. These guys were a little bit more hard living back then, drinking beer and carousing. Not saying he was doing that, but it didn't have the conditioning that we guys have today. 29, 30 years old, it was getting old back then. George Mikan was beginning to show his age, and his scoring dipped to only 18 points a game, but the Minneapolis Lakers were still able to win another title, but it'll be their last. And the following season, George Mikan retired. Now, after George Mikan retired, the Minneapolis Lakers struggled. The next couple of years, all right, they struggled. George Mikan came back, I think, a year and a half later, midway through, I can't remember which year, but let's say 56, somewhere around that time. But George Mikan, by that time, was a shell of himself. He hadn't played in a little while, and the league was changing. Now, because of the shot clock being instituted before the 54-55 season, now the pace was so much faster. Now it was starting to resemble the modern era. Now, instead of the final score being 69-68, now scores routinely were in the one teens. You know what I'm saying? That, coupled with the fact that George Mikan was now around 270, 275, he struggled, and he abruptly retired. Now, after he retired, George Mikan tried to become a lawyer, law practice. He struggled with this. Eventually, he had struggles trying to prosper as a lawyer. Not too long after he retired, he ran for Congress in Minnesota, and off his popularity at the time, and he nearly won. I think it was a 1956 election. He nearly won election, but he lost in that congressional election. And for the next couple of years, George Mikan kind of struggled, man, financially. His law practice didn't really go off, or didn't really prosper the way he thought it would, and eventually he had to cash in his life insurance savings. Eventually, George Mikan found, I don't want to say found a job, but George Mikan was tapped as the first commissioner of the ABA, which was the main competition of the NBA back in the late 60s into the 70s. And it was George Mikan that came up with two brilliant ideas. It was his idea to have the red, white, and blue ball, and it was his idea to institute the three-point shot, which became a staple of the ABA, and eventually the NBA adopted it 12 years later themselves. What George Mikan became known for in later years was leading the charge for older players to receive financial compensation. Prior to 1965, which is kind of the cutoff period, like that's when 1965 is when you started seeing the bigger salaries of NBA players as the Chamberlain-Russell era commenced and the NBA began to grow and revenue soared, and that's when you started seeing NBA players finally starting to have bigger salaries to the point where they didn't have to have other jobs. You know, they didn't have to have side jobs as plumbers or side jobs driving a taxi or side jobs being a carpenter or side jobs being a salesman. Now these guys, and it pisses me off so badly when people like Chris Bosh say, oh, Bill Russell played against plumbers. Like, dude, these dudes had to have these side jobs because unlike you, motherfucker, they didn't have $1 million salaries. You know what I'm saying? That shit pisses me the fuck off when these guys do this. Sorry, I didn't mean to go off on a tangent there, but George Mikan helped to lead the way for players of his generation and a little bit afterward to get financial compensation. All right? He led that charge for years. It was George Mikan that led the this panel for who put pressure on the NBA to bring NBA basketball back to the Minneapolis Lakers in the 80s. Eventually, that's why you saw the formation of the Minneapolis Timberwolves. So you can either thank or curse George Mikan for that. But, you know, as sad as this is for me to say this, my only recollections of George Mikan as a child were him being mentioned as one of the great players of all time. But as a child, he was ill. When I was a child, he was ill. He was suffering from diabetes. He had diabetes for many years. He had kidney problems. I remember when George Mikan was honored at the 50 Greatest tournament, 50 Greatest celebration, the All-Star game in '97. He was fading then. You know, at that time, he walked with a cane. I remember Bill Russell had to assist George Mikan in being able to get up at the stand. And, you know, when you read about George Mikan's last years, it's sad. It's sad that the NBA didn't assist those guys. And I'm going to tell you something. Charles Barkley is a coon. Don't get me wrong. He does a lot of shit to piss me off. But it's one thing Charles Barkley does do that I agree with. And he refuses, one of the reasons why he refuses to be on these video games is because he says, I would let you guys use my likeness if you would agree to take $1 million of this money and donate it to NBA retired player salaries. He said, you do that and you can use my likeness for free, but they won't do it. So, you know, but yeah, George Mikan, the last years of his life, He had his legs amputated. He had to go through dialysis 4 times a day. And in June of 2005, I believe it was, June 2005. No, it was June 2006. It was June 2006. I remember being 18 days before his birthday. In June of 2006, right before the NBA Finals, I remember it, between the Dallas Mavericks and the Miami Heat, George Mikan passed away at the age of 81. And I remember Shaquille O'Neal paid for his funeral because, George Mikan's family was struggling financially with the cost of his medical care. And it just pisses me off, man, how these guys, George Mikan was a guy who helped to create the foundation to what these guys have today, and he was struggling financially with that. Where were the other players? You trying to tell me that the NBA, all the money they make, they couldn't have a little bit of a fund? The billions of dollars these guys were making back then, they couldn't have any money stashed away to help these guys. They couldn't give these guys a pension at all. They didn't have a pension. That's why I applaud the NBA today for now having at least a healthcare system separate in place for these older guys. But these guys, these pioneers, these guys from the 40s and 50s into the 60s, they had nothing. Nothing. And to me, that's a stain on David Stern's legacy. You know what I'm saying? But this is the first guy, man, that was truly a legend in his time, George Mikan, the first true superstar of the NBA.